Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome the audience, the world, to this first roundtable discussion. This is a discussion on India, sexuality, health, stigma. We are based at the University of Chicago, the Gleacher Center in Chicago. This event is being sponsored in part by the University of Chicago, the Center for International Studies, the Committee on South Asian Studies, the School of Social Services Administration, the Global Health Initiative. We have brought today together a group of scholars who focus on India and/or sexuality and to discuss several themes which I'll address in a minute. I'd first like to introduce the panel, including myself. I'm John Schneider. I'm a faculty member within the Departments of Medicine and Health Studies. I do work, public health work in India, focused on HIV prevention. We have, over here to our right is Dr. Lawrence Cohen. He's faculty within the Department of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. He is a faculty member who studies sexuality in India, medicine, health, and the body. We also have Sanjay Srivastava, who's in the Department of Sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth. He is an anthropologist, and his research interests include masculinities, sexualities, urban and middle-class cultures. We also have Anjali Arundekar from Santa Cruz. She's in the Department of Feminist Studies. She's a historian. She studies the poetics and politics of sexuality, colonialism, and historiography. We have Dr. Niranjan Karnik, who's in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Chicago. He's a sociologist and an adolescent psychiatrist, and he studies issues surrounding high-risk youth and drug use, both in the United States and formerly in Mumbai, India. We have Philip Kumar, who's an independent consultant from Hyderabad. He does work consulting the government of India, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on issues of HIV prevention amongst men who have sex with men. We have Stuart Michaels, who's a research scientist within the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. He wrote the homosexuality chapters for the Seminole Sex Survey in the United States, and with experience on Western sexual identity. The conversation, it's a conversation today. It will be moderated by Dr. William Mozzarella, who's in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. He studies political anthropology of mass publicity, commodity aesthetics, and post-coloniality with an ethnographic focus on India. So I'd like to welcome everybody today. And this is a unique venue and form of discussion. The format is basically going to focus on three major themes that we'd like to cover today. We will go for about 75 minutes, and this will be followed by a 30-minute break where the audience, both in the United States and around the world, we have groups in India, Hyderabad, and New Delhi, will be posing questions and comments, which we will catalog during the intermission, and then we will address during the second half of the discussion. There are three major areas that we'd like to focus on today. We will start off with issues surrounding sexual identity in India and how these sexual identities may be shaped or may shape Western sexual identities. This has been largely brought to bear within the context of HIV, and we'll discuss how that affects the sexual identity. The second component that we're going to focus on is media representation of sexual identity in India. How that media representation is how is that affected by the West? How does that affect the West's own media representation? We're also going to focus on Penal Code 377 and the debates, the current debates and briefings on the legalization of same-sex behavior and identity. So first I'd like to just start it off by, there's this notion, right or wrong, that sexual identity, homosexuality is a construct, is a component of the West that has been brought to India. And I know the panel has certain feelings about that, and so I'd like to first turn it over to Lawrence Cohen, who's discussed this at length previously.
Thank you, John. Is this okay? Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and since many of the panelists, and I think many people who think about both sexual politics and AIDS, think a lot about the importance of location. And since we're in Chicago, we might want to start, I just will start by acknowledging the long history of people in this city who have focused upon sexual politics around South Asia, and I'm thinking of Ifti Nassim, but many others, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me say a few things very briefly in response, and the first would be that this question of is what's often called homosexuality something which is imported to India is in some ways an interesting question. It came up very recently when the current health minister of India, Ghulam Nabi Azad, said quite famously that, unfortunately, this is translated from the Hindi, unfortunately there is a disease in the world which has come to our country, which is absolutely unnatural and should not happen, but it does. And he was thought to be speaking about homosexuality, but the next day said I was speaking actually about AIDS. What was at stake in part in his comments were two things. First, that homosexuality is unnatural. Now, this goes back to the language of a law, 377, which has been at stake for the last few years in India, but also that it should not happen in this country or elsewhere. And the question was, is homosexuality something foreign? And to the extent that homosexuality is an idea that is developed in a very specific way in Europe in the 19th century, then surely homosexuality is a globally circulating term, and it's many activists, historians have argued, Sanskritists, literary scholars, that there are forms of same-sex sexual desire, of transgendered practice, of aesthetics, in many Indian genres, traditions, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in the last few years, there's been a turn to, especially with the rise of many NGOs and community organizations focused on AIDS, to the question of what are local Indian ways of thinking about same-sex behavior. And one such, or two such categories have been the Koti and the Panti. Koti in the as defined being a man who defines himself in a variety of feminine ways and sexually desires to be penetrated. And a Panti is the man who defines himself as, quote, a man, and who he has sex with. And arguments are made that this is a traditional category and that it's been around forever, and it's basically a pan-South Asian category, from Dhaka to Peshawar, from Kanyakumari to Srinagar, and so forth. And so some of us, I wrote a controversial paper some years back which argued that Koti draws upon many long-standing ways of thinking and practice, but in fact comes together because of AIDS. That is, it's a category created by activists and by community members for many important reasons: to get money to people, to create prevention efforts, to link very disparate regions under the same language, and tied to the demands of funders to have a coherent set of categories, to the demands of epidemiologists to have things that they can count and get funding for, and tied to the demands of, and so forth. And one of the questions has been, because of course whether or not Koti is developed in the 1990s, it becomes for many a category of organization, of activism in many different parts of India. And so one question that I would start with is what is the relationship between funders in the AIDS world, community organization, both groups that are often grouped together as MSM, or men who have sex with men groups, but also a range of of queer and feminist politics and the government of India and other governments? And how do these things form the conditions under which people develop resources to get access to drugs, to get access to community, to get access to political resources dealing with the police and discrimination and so forth?
So it seems like there are really two kinds of questions on the table here in that comment. One of them has to do with when does it become useful to have a coherent identity, or a coherent label, a coherent marker, under what conditions, what can it enable, what can it prevent, what can it trouble. Another one has to do with this question of foreignness versus Indianness, right? Under what conditions does it become important, and for whom does it become important to be able to claim that this is something indigenous or this is something important, etc. Imported, etc. So I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on either one of those two coming off of Lawrence's statements.
I think I'll just add a small sort of wrinkle to the story, as it were. And I think the recent circulation of the brief of 377 that the Lawyers Collective and many related organizations compiled it tells a very difficult and yet compelling story of the connections that Lawrence is saying. And I think it's bifurcated along two lines. One is the us, not us, the West versus the rest. And so if you look at the contents of the brief, and these debates are, I'm using the brief as the event, but of course these questions are percolating everywhere, not just in the debates around 377, in families who are trying to understand the sexual behaviors of their children, who have briefly flirted with the West, et cetera, is how do you debate the idea of the us and the not us? So what 377 did was something very interesting, which goes to the foreign, not foreign as well, is they battled with the idea of the fact that homosexuality is both of our time and not of our time. So meaning one of the things they did was to say that if we don't get rid of these draconian laws, we are out of time with the rest of the world. But they also indicated that the draconian laws were imposed in the idea of a Judeo-Christian time mode, and in our time, whatever Hindustani time may be, I'll use a more secular term, those laws would not have made any sense. So the battle of whose time is one way to think about it. The second, and I think more interesting thing that 376 did was that they concertedly used Hindu sources to speak about the presence of homosexuality in the past. And as someone who works in the past, this is an important political move because it addresses the second part of the foreignness, right? It's no longer just the West and the rest. It's also about how the other, in whatever form, whether it's the Muslim, it's the Hijra, or it's the lesbian, who is of course missing today for obvious reasons, and I'm not touting that as a figure that needs to return, but there are all kinds of absences, right? So I think it'd be worthwhile to think about not just the West as being the kind of bully that we're trying to get out of, but also to think about other bullies. And the Bhajap, the BJP is obviously the big guy in the room, but there are local outfits that don't agree with the BJP. So for example, Bal Thackeray, when the whole controversy around fire, which is now history almost, he was very happy that the heroines, if the heroines had Muslim names, he was happy for the film to have come out. His only problem was that the heroines were called Sita and Radha. It wasn't about the content of their acts per se. So those are interesting ways to imagine, and especially given what's going on around the panic around migration, movement of bodies across borders inside and outside of India, from Bangladesh, Nepal, of course, which affects the sex work industry enormously, both on multiply gendered forms. So I think we need to be a little bit more robust about how we imagine the idea of the foreign, right? Those of us who've grown up in India, the idea of the foreign hand has always been a very, anything goes wrong, it's the foreign hand, right? So but it has multiple implications now when you think about the foreign hand.
So Philip, I was wondering if the people that you work with, to what extent do some of these questions and problematics about the foreign, the non-foreign, the indigenous, the importance of certain kinds of categorical labels, to what extent do they matter to the constituents that you work with?
As John had introduced, I was working in the coastal AP, doing the implementation of the Gates Foundation program for the MSMs. And it took some time for us to actually teach them the terms of MSMs because it was completely new to them. And this term MSM was invented after the HIV had come into scene. So they were familiar with Koti, Panti, but the double-decker was a new term for them. and so does, like acquired nirvana among the TGs was, kind of, it was in the parlance, it was in use among these MSMs. But the MSM terminology was a big no-no. So it was kind of, it took some time for us to teach them. And therefore, it was always perceived as a foreign term, a foreign thing which is coming into them. But the behavior as such, it has been there for a long time. And, people were there. But the nomenclature was kind of...
But Lawrence, Lawrence mentioned the idea that Koti has been, part of the survey now and is becoming more prominent. I mean, is there a feeling from the group that, it's just that Koti was a private term, it was a private, perhaps, identity, and now it's just been made more public?
Well, I mean, Stacey Pigg, who's an anthropologist in Canada, has asked a question about AIDS practice and prevention practice in Nepal, where she says that a lot of prevention efforts are organized around translation, not just AIDS, what is AIDS, and so forth, and but the importance of, in working with a community as an NGO, of creating a stable nomenclature. So you had to bring in MSM, and one of the questions she asks is, why is this so? Why does this become an obvious feature of public health prevention efforts, that there should be a stable nomenclature that's introduced? And I think that's in part a question that, following on William's question for us, that I put, why is the effort to create a category of MSM at all important for a prevention effort funded by the Gates Foundation? I mean, it's an interesting question.
Stuart?
Yeah, I just want, the question, the interesting thing about MSM, and it is the point that I sort of wanted to, what's interesting when we set this up and we asked the question about a foreign import to India, it also sort of fixes the West as if it's a homogeneous, and as if the categories, I mean, Lawrence gestured to the fact that homosexuality as a category actually is a recent invention in the West. But it's still, in these kinds of debates, hard to keep in touch with how variable and debated it is. So to me, as a gay activist from the 70s getting involved in the AIDS movement, the creation of the term MSM was kind of shocking. So it was itself a new creation to distinguish between behavior and identity, and because we were faced with the problem of who are we talking about, who are we talking to, what language can we find to both sort of study and interact with people. And the term gay or homosexual was a term which was going to exclude a lot of people who were involved in behaviors that were putting them at risk for HIV. So you have this fluidity and changeability and history on both sides, and in any given moment we're sort of trying to figure out this also who we're talking about, who we're talking to. And I think part of this, that's for me always the problem of these categories. I mean, the difference between category and identity, I mean, who is using a certain term and for what purpose is always in question. And the outside person, in whatever form of outsiderness and whatever relationship is going on, applying a category to other people, and then the people themselves creating a response to that using either the same or other categories is part of the problem, both of knowledge, but also of how do we organize and what do we do.
That's right, and I think, Stuart, your point about the relationship between designations that are based on the apparently innocent category of behavior, as opposed to the apparently much more complex category of identification, is a really interesting one and perhaps worth discussing more. Sanjay?
Just some general points. I think one of the contexts, it seems to me, is that not just in inverted homosexual culture, but the general rise of discussions of sexuality in India, right? General, and I say kind of a heterosexual within the heterosexual context. So William, your own work on the media, for example, there's been a general efflorescence in the last 25 years about why, and we should think about why it is that suddenly people want to discuss sexuality. In many sort of so-called women's magazines in Hindi, at least in North India, there's been really explicit discussion over the last 25 years about lesbianism, about women and pleasure, and also about homosexuality of different kinds. So sexuality itself has become something that people want to talk about as an aspect of themselves. Now, within that, then you have cities like Delhi which want to be seen as a global city. So you have the sense in the media that a global city needs a homosexual culture as well, right? So you have a rise of media articles about that we have these wonderful homosexual gay people, lesbians. But of course, the problem is, as many friends say, that if you are a gay person in Delhi, you're not allowed to talk about slum evictions. You must only talk about gay and lesbian issues, right? So if you're also an activist who is interested in other kinds of politics, your identity is, the media doesn't want to deal. They'll say, but you're a gay person. Why the hell are you talking about slum evictions? Talk about sexual issues. So the other thing is about what's happening within sort of cities and how they want to be seen. And I think the really interesting shift has been from the older Kama Sutra narrative in India, that Indian sexuality is essentially about Kama Sutra, and what the link was between this sort of, ancient text and contemporary sexual culture has never been clear. I think what the discussions around AIDS, HIV, homosexuality has done is destabilize that kind of conversations. That you still have books, coffee table books being published about Kama Sutra, but that's been destabilized. And I just wanted to say something about 377. Regarding Anjali's point, what's interesting about 377 is that simultaneously as it's brought into public discussion, ideas of it's been read down, right? It hasn't been decriminalized yet, yeah? And simultaneously is that, of course, the manner in which the petition was filed has also then stigmatized other kinds of groups. So because the petition was filed mainly in terms of a health initiative, saying that if you don't allow us to do this work in public, that it is greater risk in terms of HIV/AIDS. What that is, the notions of publicness and privateness, because they've been so crucial to this and 377 movement, anti-377 movement, means that it seems to have primarily become one about middle-class gay men in Delhi.
Right.
So it stigmatized actually others who don't have access to private spaces, number one. It stigmatized another, I want to link it also because a lot of the judges in 377 case borrowed some of their thinking from American case studies. And the American case study that they borrowed the judgment, based the judgment boards, was also one which said, well, homosexuality is natural, number one, because it's not monetized, right? So it automatically stigmatizes, for example, sex workers in India. It stigmatizes others who don't have access to these sorts of spaces. So the interesting ways in which the HIV debates in India are so specifically linked to broader issues, which in well-meaning ways, actually, I think as Lawrence was pointing out, people were filing cases against 377. But the manner in which it was done has actually made it very difficult. You'd see, say, gay people in India and, say, sex workers are kind of natural allies because they're both stigmatized. But, of course, through this judgment, what has happened is it established a hierarchy of good sex and bad sex. So good sex have become, through this judgment, homosexual people because it's not monetized. But then sex workers, and that's borrowed a lot from American judgments about, how intimacy is good and homosexuality is okay because it's not monetized after all. And so the interesting ways in which these contexts have become linked, and I think many people watching in India would be familiar with these kinds of arguments. So
just one important caveat, and this is, I think, to take up Sanjay's very important point about what questions are silenced when you focus on one issue and the other. And I think another important piece of this collaboration that has fallen away is the Feminist Project. And I'm thinking about particularly the work of people like Flavia Agnes, who is a very prominent legal feminist activist based in Bombay, or Mumbai, as we currently say, who one of her projects is, of course, around sex workers. But the argument she has made about the project of 377, which is a compelling argument and worth thinking about, which goes to Sanjay's question of what communities are being represented through this project, is she's been citing a couple of cases that she's working on with women who are married. So this is also about, if 377 is a criticism of the marriage form, the heterosexual form of marriage, or the family form as being not one that one should want to recuperate or hold on to. Her question is that she has clients whose married partners who are men have sex with other men. So the writing down of the repeal, not the decriminalization of 377, makes that behavior legitimate in the eyes of the law, if that is what the end point is, but it doesn't allow it the status of adultery. So, for example, these women who are interested in divorcing or separating from their husbands cannot use the categories that are ordinarily used for divorce or separation because that behavior hasn't been folded in or addressed through these other legal issues. So I think if we want to think about these questions as questions that are about social justice, for gender questions, then you also have to address is what is happening to women who are in relationships. And this is an issue that is in the United States. The first organizations that started in New York, in San Francisco, like Trikon, like Salga, which are organizations based primarily for South Asian Americans, were organized around the debate around should we let men who are in heterosexual marriages into these support groups, because what does it do to our feminism, right? Now, this is a very different version of that question, and I'm not advocating for outing or any kind of coercive censorship around who gets to be in and out, but it is worth thinking about that as we embrace the liberatory politics of 377, what kinds of other heterosexual forms stay stable, right? And I think the marriage form is one that, you know, Srimati Basu is another very important feminist scholar who works on this question, has been asking, and I think we need to talk about, as Sanjay has been bringing up.
Can I add another layer of complexity
Please.
to this? So as putting on my hat as the sort of person who thinks about development, I want to point out that I think the discussion to this point has been focused on these broad societal tensions, you know, that through which these categories play out. And I think there's a dynamic through which this comes down into families that's important to think about. So one of the things that I have sort of seen every day in my practice and, you know, working with young people is the way in which there's an assumption that children and adolescents sort of adopt the culture of their parents. And I think it's actually a mistaken assumption, because they actually have their own cultural form, which is an emergent process that's in tension and in resistance to, in part, their parents.
So Niranjan, could you say a little bit more just in terms of context about the kinds of kids that you're working with? And
So, you know, I'm working with underserved youth, both here in Chicago and, you know, in the recent past in India and South Asia. And, you know, a lot of the children that I work with are homeless or on the streets. And these are kids who are very much marginalized and have either left of their own choice from their families or have been thrown out by their families. And in those situations, and even in my more routine practice, which I have at the University of Chicago, where I work with adolescents, you know, from middle class, you know, families in the Chicagoland area, I hear these stories constantly. How parents don't understand me, you know, I'm not what they expect to be, you know, in various ways. And I think that there is this sort of rising tension among adolescents as a whole that pushes up against, and this is, I think, a dynamic that happens in every generation. If you look historically, I think actually there's always this push from the adolescents against the adults. It's a very, I think, a developmentally normative process. But sexuality is something that emerges in that process as well. And as children become adolescents and teenagers and have a sense of their own sexual identity. So, I mean, it's interesting, we're sitting here talking about terms like MSM, homosexuality, gay, lesbian, right? I actually have a lot of adolescents in my practice who are in schools of Chicago who would resist all of those terms,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
Who want to exist in this very undefined nexus, and there's some experimentation going on, some questions, and they tend to actually resolve their identities gradually over time. So I think when it comes to the issue of identity, we have to keep in mind that it is an emergent process, right? And there's always tensions both generationally, but also in terms of the society's politics, which we've been talking about. And I just think that developmental aspect to it is important to remember, because that's part of the force of change. And you know, Sanjay, when you were talking about, you know, why is it that India is talking about sexuality now, right? Like, why has this become a topic? And I think it's become more of a topic in the U.S. One of the things that I see pushing that trend is, in part, you know, I see a lot of advertising and sexualization of youth in multiple contexts. In India and the U.S., there have been some very interesting debates in the United Kingdom recently about advertising there and its impact on youth. And I think that that's one factor that's driving, I think, the conversation. we can discuss the moralities of those things if we like, but I just think that this is one other thing I want to add into the discussion.
Sure. Well, that gets us to one of our other sort of headings that John mentioned earlier on, which is the relationship of all this to a politics of representation and to publicly circulating images. And I'm sure that all of us, from our various perspectives, the kinds of work that we've been doing have various kinds of reflections on that and how these publicly circulating representations both become foci for all kinds of struggles and arguments, but also how they function as means for identification, as objects of longing or aspiration or aversion, as the case may be. So, Sanjay, I'm sure you have thoughts, for instance, on this one.
I wanted to make one point just before that. One is this discussion about the invention of identity categories versus the other actually existing works, the kind of work that Philip is involved in. I don't think any of us would deny that once sort of a category is so-called invented, that the politics around that category is important, right? So it becomes an organizing principle, for example. So I think two need to exist in tension. We need to obviously, as Lauren says, talk about how categories become invented. But simultaneously then, there is another kind of politics, like in the West. So the gay becomes an organizing term. You wouldn't deny it just because it was invented in the 18th, 19th centuries. So, and certainly in the Indian context, for people certainly who work in the NGO sector, I think it's important that all of us keep that in tension. So, and people do that, and that's something for me, it's quite important. I think in terms of media representation, I think what's been happening in the popular media is a real sense of anxiety. Simultaneously, as you have so-called gay filmmakers in the mainstream who make mainstream Bollywood cinema, for example, with so-called, gay people in it. I think it's a site of great anxiety right now. Certainly a certain kind of male heterosexual anxiety about not just discussions of sexuality, but homosexuality in the public sphere. And I'm using the term homosexuality in the sense of same sex rather than man sex, in order to include both all kinds of identities. I think a significant way in terms of media representations is simultaneously as people want to be seen as cosmopolitan because you're discussing non-heterosexual issues. It's underlined by a huge amount of anxiety. So there hasn't actually so far, there's been kind of documentary-like films, but there's been no serious mainstream film which actually treats it as a complex issue rather than a kind of in a stereotypic sense. So there's this tension between, in middle class India, between being seen to be a cosmopolitan person living in a city that has gay people, but simultaneously, how do you represent them? And I think the representation is completely racked by a sense of anxiety about the fact that you have same-sex practices. And we can see this both in the media, television, in advertisements, and certainly in cinema. And I think it's heterosexual male anxiety, not as a more specific, it seems to me, theme that runs through representations in the media.
I think there's one other place in which these conversations are happening, and I think this is where I would have limited understanding of the question, is the regional kind of representation of these questions. So for example, in Maharashtra, particularly in Mumbai, and I was telling Sanjay this yesterday, there is a robust, and I mean robust in the best sense of the word, discussion in Marathi talk shows, for example, around questions of bisexuality, which has been coming up. So I have an overly zealous mother and a father who are invested in this question, who are constantly ringing me up, and relatives who write to me with editorials that are published in Lok Sahitta, Maharashtra Times. And the interest that they have is in finding pieces that do not represent the question of homosexuality in a tragic mode, right? Because that's been so you have the kind of downtrodden or disenfranchised homosexual queer figure who is then misunderstood and dies, or etc. So the thing that I have noticed in the last 5 years, particularly in Marathi language-based talk shows, of which there are quite a few, is that there is a lot of discussion on not just male homosexuality, but I think more problematically bisexuality, which is something that falls away, right? And I think that is more tense creating than the stabilization of both. And I think that's been a question, and that's where the question of women tends to come out more. So And it's both a good thing and a bad thing, right? Because the bisexual always holds out the possibility of a return, which the other two categories don't. So it might be worthwhile to think about genres like the talk show, some of which are very salacious and are very interested in just telling one story, but then others which may be, and I would be curious to hear from Philip, for example, whether in Andhra or, I mean, Sanjay and I have sort of suggested one version of the story, but in other language, because there are different genealogies for how these representations emerge. For example, Vijay Tendulkar, who's one of the most important Marathi playwrights, wrote a very important play about two women, and there have been movie representations earlier on around these questions. So we have different understandings and habits of mind when we look at these questions. So I'd be interested to hear from your perspective as well.
Yeah. Taking the cue from Sanjay's, about the mainstream Bollywood movies, it's like I got this phone call from the community friend of mine, who called me up from Vizag and he said, sir, I think now we have moved from being a joker to being a hero in the films. I said, what does it mean? So he said that, earlier all the films, whenever they had to project a MSM character, a gay kind of a character, it was only for the comic scenes. He was a comedian, he was like, looked down upon, and he was never an important character in the film. But with Kal Ho Na Ho or with a Dostana kind of a movie, and Amitabh Bachchan's son, Abhishek Bachchan playing the lead role of being a gay or Koti identity, I think it was a big movement, So I think we need to, it's very interesting to see that kind of change and move from being a comedian to a protagonist in the movie, and and making the movie a Bollywood hit also.
Could you say more of that, or maybe back to Anjali, because when I saw, the Dostana, which is a very comic film, and so in a sense they are the main roles. It's no longer a side role, but it's very much within the tradition, going back in many ways to the Marathi roots of film in the tamasha, that in which the
and the Launi as well,
in which the queer character is the source of comedy. So what's happened is the queer comic character has become the protagonist of comedy. So on the one hand, what you're talking about is a shift in the organization of comedy. But when someone's calling you up and saying this is a good thing, one of the questions is, how is that playing, for the public? And the second question is where is the tragic coming in? Because it actually raises the question of the tragic hero. I mean, whether it's a big film or heroine. Well, from Fire to My Brother Nikhil to in that sense, and you could argue that one of the things that NGOs do in order to justify themselves is to produce, through interviews and materials, through ethnography, tragic stories. Because tragic stories remind us of how important something is, of why this is a real pressing social concern. And so one could argue there's a lot of forces that produce tragic narrative, and that the function of comic narrative may have a different function in a moment in which NGOs are very, very central to how sexual categories are being produced.
So if I could just add on to that one thing. So on the one hand, I think, yes, absolutely, it's a very interesting point that in a way there's a kind of ethical, shall we say, a pull towards a certain kind of tragic narrative, which then enables a certain kind of public intervention and justifies it ethically. On the other hand, sort of Anjali's point about the sort of predominance of these tragic narratives then raises the question of what kinds of spaces for affirmative narratives are there, in fact. And one of them, which seems to me to have become absolutely, as it were, shall we say, omnipresent, is sort of the aspirational consumerist affirmative narrative of homosexuality, right? So a lot of what we're wrestling here with in this sort of discussion about film representations and advertising and so forth is the problem of, either you have the tragic narrative that becomes the one that justifies the kind of, as it were, paternalist intervention, or you have the affirmative sort of consumerist narrative, which then locks the representation into a certain kind of complicity with, sort of the forces of liberalization, the forces of consumerism, a certain kind of relationship to fashionable representations and certain kinds of bodies, certain kinds of ways of appearing, and certain kinds of ways of imagining oneself as a kind of self-determining, self-realizing, subject making choices about one's life, one's lifestyle, even. So just as a kind of open-ended comment.
And where would we put the public health representation then between those I mean, those categories are interesting, but I think there's also that public health representation, and Lawrence alluded earlier to, you know, the formation of categories for public health needs. I mean, I see that as, you know, the creation of an intervention object. You know, like that you need to define who it is you're going to do the intervention on, because so few now interventions, you know, are really population-wide anymore. You know, we don't think in those terms anymore, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. For example, I was recently sent. I might as well say this publicly. You know, India Today every year does this sex survey, right? And it's an event. So they recently sent me the sort of India Today is this this is a major news magazine, right? And they recently sent me. I hope she's not watching the person. survey. And this this year the topic is a family and sexuality. And they said, okay, look at this and what else we can do. And it's interesting. For example, there are a couple of questions I want to read out to you, which are potential questions will be a part of this. And you heard it here first in University of Chicago, as they said. Okay. So it says, one of this is the examples of questions, and this is the topic is, broad topic is family and sexuality. So one of the questions is, would you accept your child if it chooses an alternate sexuality? Do you think being a transsexual is acceptable? Would you support your child if he/she wanted a sex change operation? And another question was, are you more likely to forgive your husband/wife and continue with the marriage if you found out that they had a heterosexual extramarital affair, or B, a homosexual extramarital affair? So there are interesting ways in which, as Winnie, we were pointing out, that all so-called alternate sexualities stand now at the juncture of consumerism, one. The kinds of identities you want to imagine yourself as a modern person, and India Today is not, you know, it's not a sort of a radical cutting edge either feminism or sexual politics, but it's interesting in the ways in which this really mainstream magazine, which is running this thing on family and sexuality, is increasingly inserting questions within it that you would think at another time would disconcert people, but obviously India Today knows its market and doesn't think that's what's happening.
But Sanjay, the interesting thing about this would be India Today also is published in Hindi, etc. So whether the questions would be reproduced the same way.
Exactly, yeah, they are.
Right, that
because
would
they
be
translate it and
right.
And as in fact I've been saying to them, as they have been doing, to do this work in small towns. I mean, in this context, you always have to work with skepticism as well as say, well, this is what the mainstream media does, so what the hell. And they will simply translate it not just into Hindi, but other languages, and in small towns, so-called B and C category towns, among
But translate as samaling? I mean, as what? And what becomes the translation for homosexuality?
Well, quite often they use terms like gay and in terms that people understand. Yeah. And the last survey, in fact, was large numbers were people from trading families in small towns. So they've actually been quite interesting the way that they're doing it. And they seem to know their market, and it's widely popular, you know.
Well, they did. The reason why I asked this question is because they did. I mean, I've seen these annual surveys, and they did one a few years ago around the metrosexual, right? And then I had tons of youth, because I'm no longer youth, telling me that they were metrosexuals, and they were completely homophobic, of course, right? So, but the question that I had for you, Sanjay, which is I hadn't thought about it because you picked such interesting questions, is that the explosion of these surveys in a very standardized, like India Today would be like Time and Newsweek, comparable media, is that it's still stabilizing the marriage form, right? Very much. So the question that we return to over and over again is that it's the capital consumption. You produce different so that you can have more markets, not because you want to. Which goes to the question I had for you, Niranjan, which is you brought up the interesting thing about health, public health. Now, what's remarkable about the public health consumption around HIV prevention, particularly in gay media in the US, and also now mainstream media, is you always see happy gay men with HIV, right? They are ripping with muscles, they look better than most of us. And so the project is to produce the idea of a life that continues, in fact, in better shape, as it were, despite or because of the pharmaceutical management of HIV. Now, we don't have that counterpart, particularly in the global south, because so is it a developmental narrative that we know we've arrived when we can show pictures of healthy men with HIV. You see what I'm asking? I'm curious about what's the representational endpoint because that's been the endpoint here in the US and in Europe particularly, right? You do see, I mean, any magazine you see the cocktail mentioned, and then
okay, I have two answers, I think, or two thoughts about it. One is more cynical than the other. So the cynical side of me says, well, those ads are purely a function of pharmaceutical advertising.
Absolutely.
Like that's all that they are really is, you take these medicines and this is what it will produce, The more optimistic side of me says there's also within that, I think, an embedded kind of consideration that in the West, at least, this disease has, for some segment of the population, I won't say all, because there is still an underserved population in the U.S. who don't have insurance, who don't have access to these medicines or treatments, okay? So I want to be very clear about that being there. But there is a segment of the population in the U.S. for whom this disease has become a chronic illness. It has gone from this acute killer, right? And that, I think, is the striking change in the discourse of AIDS in the U.S. is how that shift happened.
Right.
And the medications that led to that really are, I mean, I think remarkable. I mean, the stories, around the time when I was sort of in medical school were, people at death's door, being given these medicines and all of a sudden having a new life, right? And so I think that there is something to these treatments, but you can see the two sides of it very, very clearly. And I'm interested to see, because as Lawrence was pointing out, I think that those medications, actually need a stable health object, right? That we can all agree upon, that HIV is this, virus, and the medications treat that, right? And so in order to globalize the use of these medicines, you have to have that discourse.
For sure.
Now, I think one of the things that's interesting that we're discussing is how those risk categories kind of surround that, and sort of in some ways create that moment.
Yeah, can I, so excellent point. I mean, there are a number of issues to that. Also the idea that if this is what HIV is, then maybe HIV isn't that bad, and that that can also be a counter.
And if I can add one thing, John, I don't actually think that advertising, the pharmaceutical advertising aspect of this, is unique to HIV per se.
No, it isn't.
Because I see it in my discipline of psychiatry, right? You see, these happy faces if you take these medicines. I've actually had patients, come into the office and say, I want that medicine with the smiley happy face. It's the Zoloft one.
No, I think the only reason I brought it
right?
up is because as someone who has led a binational life for a long time, during the era of ACT UP, when I was in graduate school in Philadelphia, you would bring, and I lost a lot of friends to the disease, to use the minister's words. You would bring out the people with lesions, right? ACT UP strategy was let us tell you how your body will be ravaged.
Right.
And this is a strategy that's used by both the media in the West and the rest to point to the ravages of disease in other parts of the world, right? So that the body that's ravaged, which is why media representations are important, because then you have a body having sex, like the Don't Know Why dreadful film that we are not talking about because a lot of us haven't seen it. But for example, I've seen the film, but the bust of the film is that these two men are having sex and they have beautiful bodies, and we get to see a different kind of gay body than a body that's ravaged or needing medication, etc. So that's why I was curious about it.
But I think there was an interesting moment in India, and the background paper which John posted was part of that thing, because we were discussing India today. And one of the things I looked for at that time point when I was writing on this in graduate school was the different ways that India today actually represented the cover images of the HIV epidemic. And talking about bodies, they showed sort of the full figure of this woman, a poor woman with HIV on the cover, seeing her face, who she was, very much a visualization of her body. But then a few years later, there was another cover issue of India Today where they covered the AIDS epidemic, and we're talking about how it penetrated the middle class now. And in that cover photo, all you see are the woman's eyes behind this black screen, basically. So you're not allowed to see her body because in some ways, you know,
middle class.
the voyeurism of looking at the poor and impoverished in India was allowed in some ways, or given space. And, you know, once it hits the middle class, it became this much more secretive thing. And I think that public-private tension that we were discussing earlier, I think was very much apparent to me as I was looking over that history in some form.
I just want to get back to a point, then ask Stuart a question. Something that interests all of us is the issue of consumerism. See, I don't think that consumerism is predictable. I mean, I think we need to think about what kind of politics it is. Because I think it is a certain kind of politics. In the European case, it was a certain kind of politics that, you know, it allowed women, for example, to go into the public sphere. And I'm wondering about, in terms of sexuality, I don't think that consumerism, you know, I mean, many of us are anxious about consumerism because we have been effectively brought up in an anti-consumer social science, humanities context, right? And I think we need to think about what kind of politics it is and whether the politics of sexuality within consumerism is an empowering one or not. And I think we need to seriously think about it. I wanted to ask, for example, you know, like India Today also has these supplements. There's one recently came out it's called Women Today. That's really about successful women. And this time there's a huge article about women coming out, about lesbians. So this is again a mainstream kind of thing. So I'm a bit confused about what kind of politics consumerism does represent, because I think there are many categories of people in India who are now consuming, earlier weren't. And if you go to a shopping mall in India, they'll say this is wonderful. The air-conditioned spaces, we weren't allowed here. And of course it's a problematic context. You know, I know there are lots of problems, but how do we think, or in gated communities in India, many women say this is wonderful, you know, because of our public spaces are really degraded, and here we can move around. So rather than dismiss these hundreds of thousands of women, how do we think about consumerism as a kind of politics, and what is the fraughtness of it? So my question to Stuart was, well, historically, if you think about the American situation, how would you position the relationship between consumerism and sexuality? I mean, it's been, you know, the pink dollar has been a significant aspect of both consumer politics and other kinds of politics. I wanted to ask you about that. How would you see it in a different context?
Interestingly, the first thing I should say is that consumerism is not a category that I use and think about a lot. Right. So that's already, since my work has mainly been in sort of studying populations, sexual behavior, and identity and health. It tends to be more in this sort of, let's say, social science, pragmatic, applied, public health sort of arena. So I think there's a kind of theoretical framework and political framework, a critique of consumerism, which I'm very sympathetic to in lots of ways. But I don't know exactly how to, that isn't the terms I've tended to think of. And I think you're making a very interesting point about sort of our stance in being critical about the developments, but that the people who themselves are involved, and as an underlying motivation for many of these things, that some desire to be able to consume and to have a presence and be in public is incredibly important. I mean, there's certainly, this has been a huge, I mean, my experience of the West here, and I think that it parallels with interesting sort of slight delays and advances. I'm not saying, you know, that one place is always ahead and the other is always behind. But, you know, I just wanted, as one example of that, I mean, it's very interesting that you marked 35 years ago as the discussion of sexuality. And for me, because of the work that I do, in the West, there was also in the U.S. and the West, Western Europe, a huge problem with public discussions of sexuality. And for me, the marker is the Kinsey studies. So a place where sex research, the sexual revolution in some ways, and there's huge debates about what the sexual revolution was, whether there was one, when it was, et cetera. But I think it's unquestionable that one of the huge changes there was to bring discussion specifically in those terms into the public media. And that produced all sorts of, and of course science was often the reference. I mean, the fact that this is coming up in the context of sex surveys where we would have a lot of trouble taking them seriously as social science research, but it becomes a means for people to participate in a discussion about it. And gay, I think, I think of it as trying to create a sort of political subject, but it becomes, and it turns into, a consumption public. I mean, a marketing niche.
I'm wondering if we could, what would it give us to push the conversation around consumerism into a conversation around cosmopolitanism? Yes. And I'm thinking of cosmopolitanism in two ways as it emerges here. On the one hand, within public health language, you could argue there's two forces. To the extent that people are often mapping regions, cities, and that's central to public health practice, what's often produced by activists, et cetera, is a very careful map of different constituencies, different categories that are used. So both the many important studies done by Naz Foundation in its various forms, a very famous chart that Ashok Rao Kavi has used, which again shows the many, many sexual constituencies. All of these tend to argue that the world is full of many different groups, and these constituencies should be recognized as such, and arguably there's a kind of commitment to a certain kind of cosmopolitan ideal, and this ranges from more or less hierarchical versions of cosmopolitanism in this language. There's also, with the MSM, often a contrasting pull towards a certain kind of universalism for a variety of, often tied to a perpetual sociological vision, as found in David Greenberg's book, The Construction of Homosexuality, that the, quote, West, unquote, has a egalitarian modernity in which gay stands unlike the transgenerational or transgenderal rest of the world, and much is ignored, as you pointed out earlier in that story. But and so there often seems to be a kind of developmental vision which is purportedly anti-hierarchical, but becomes anti-cosmopolitanism. So there's that one question, the cosmopolitan in relation to public health practice, but the other is in relationship to the question of consumption. So a French scholar of fashion, Gilles Lipovetsky, once argued that the good thing about consumption is that if we're all we reduce everything to a series of self-fashioned choices, we won't have anything to fight about. And we will no longer, but in fact, one thing, and this is central to something that William has thought about for a long time, is that the demand of many groups in experiencing media comes out of an experience complexly organized around hurt. That this film hurts me. This film hurts my community, and that I turn to the state and I ask for a gift, and that gift is censorship. And so in many ways, against the certain, if you like, economy of cosmopolitanism that Lipovetsky wants to argue for through consumption, there is the experience of hurt, which comes up again and again. And so one of the questions, for example, at Danoi, which also I haven't yet seen, we tried to very hard, is, for example, since this, like many, many Hindi films before it, stages the sexual in a Catholic family, have there been concerns, for example, or specific claims for censorship by Christian communities in India? Yeah.
I think the question of moral injury, which I think, William, you said it quite eloquently, it's the contradictory logic that animates the project of consumerism, right? You cannot not want. It's an object of longing and aversion. So I think that's where, when you were asking, can these be empowering? Yes, they can, but the empowerment comes with an understanding of the violence that carries over, right? So, and then I think the moral, injury thing you see in Sabah Mahmood's work, for example, around the cartoons, the Danish cartoons, is how does moral injury get understood by the state and by the communities that it represents, right? So the regionalism, just to return over and over again, to the ways in which the questions of sexuality are understood within India, I wouldn't say South Asia because I'm not familiar as much with locations outside of India, is something we need to be attentive to more and more, right? So the Goan, it's not Catholic, it's Goan. There are many kinds. There's no Syrian Catholics. These are not Carolites. These are Goans, right? So the relationship of Goa, the Portuguese colonial state, which had very different legislations around sexuality, around prostitution, for example, have not been thought about or understood at all. And I'm not saying this simply to add to our knowledge of the world, so to speak, but what does it tell us about the ways in which we are reproducing those forms? So, for example, the 377 case and the repeal, the cases that they did not write about are equally interesting. And this is not a gesture to say, oh, I wish they had, or, you know, they were lax, but these were strategic choices. So, for example, and I've written about this, many of the cases they didn't talk about from the 1890s were cases involving Chamar communities, right, who were accused of being brought up on charges of sodomy, but they're usually cases that were around inter-Chamar violence, or were staging religious communalism in its good-fashioned version. So what would it mean to think about sexuality as being produced because of other conflicts, not in spite of other conflicts, right? So it's not simply about saying, oh, sexuality is connected to all these issues, but rather that it comes into play. It's what Israel is doing right now, right? The pink washing, right? We treat our homos really well, but screw the Palestinians, right? So that's kind of what we have to be careful around when we think about what kinds of progressive politics of representation we want to grasp around, right? Is that it's not that sexuality is connected to what is it covering over as well, right? If we continue to just focus on, and I think that's what you were saying about when you're talking about homeless youth, etc., is that when we privilege that variable, what other things are lost in some ways. So, and I think this is something we have to live in a world where sexuality is being used by the state as a very, very kind of reliable form of governmentality. That's a very dangerous place to be.
So there's the politics of injury on one hand, which can, under certain conditions, serve to reaffirm various kinds of moral orders, various kinds of imagined communities. That's one thing going on here. And then there's the pragmatics of public attention as well. And I think part of what we're skirting around when we're talking about mass publicity and representations and so forth is both the political economy and, as it were, the sort of emotional economy of representation, right? So if we're talking about India Today, for instance, the India Today covers, here are a series of attempts to forge iconic images which are underwritten by advertisers. So there's a political economy there of what can be done or not be done. But they're not directly images that are oriented towards achieving a certain kind of immediate incitement to do something or to not do something, right? I mean, they're more sort of images oriented towards organizing a certain kind of meaning, if you like.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say we don't know.
Right.
We don't know how, it's simplistic, simply put, we don't know what that image does. It does something for me and you. For example, I mean, Philip's friend who said, this is wonderful that we are being represented in this manner. And of course, we would offer certain kinds of criticisms. I mean, at one level, of course, I'd be critical of that. Another level, I'd say, rather than me just simply saying, let's dismiss these, at one level, I may do that. But another level, I want to ask Philip, when they were saying to you, isn't it wonderful that we are being represented in the mainstream cinema as lead characters. Obviously they had some sense that it's, that the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited, if I could put it that way. So I don't know how to deal with it. I mean, how do you actually take consumerism seriously? Because I think the consequences of consumerism are utterly unpredictable. And I think part of my own discomfort is we have all been brought up within certain kinds of understanding of what is politics, like feminism, etc., etc. What is the other kind of politics, and how should we examine it?
But Sanjay, I'm curious about why you're staging it as a binary. I mean, I think for me as a queer feminist, I would say what's really exciting about this agon, right? This thing that, these representations are, not the best, but we'll take them because at least we're there. But I think that's, people are, it's not a place of contestation, it's a place of possibility, I think, for all of us.
It's not a binary, it's just that I don't know, I think it's much more unpredictable what it does. I don't know. That's why I think Philip's friends, maybe you could say, these people were really excited that finally, even in we are there.
It had to do with that herd sentiment, Sanjay, because in the earlier movies, whenever, and especially in the Telugu movies, the regional movies that we have seen, the the regional movies, the gay character was always beaten upon, like he was humiliated, he was like choked upon, and he was kicked, and so there was, and so suddenly they see that there is this characterization of gay in a Hindi movie, and and they are being celebrated, and the film is a hit. So therefore that change, I think they were very happy, and probably when we discussed deeper into this, they said that this is a start, and probably in the next 10-15 years we'll actually see the main lead Hindi film heroes or the Telugu film heroes. Right now they just can't, like Chiranjeevi or a Venkatesh, they just can't do a role which is closer to that. They won't touch it.
20 years from we could have Lawrence as a father figure.
Yeah.
But Kamal Hassan, but it's tricky. So there's like Chachi Charsobis, but yeah.
Yeah.
But so Philip, in your own work as a consultant and so forth, I mean, to what extent are you drawn upon to advise on questions of representation, for instance?
Really, very honestly, I'm not into that. I'm into the implementation of an HIV work.
Right.
So, yeah.
But so what I'm asking is, because coming out of Niranjan's point about public health representation, I mean, nowadays it seems that any kind of intervention increasingly requires some kind of theory of publicity, if you like, some kind of theory of how one would intervene into the public sphere of mass circulating images. So I mean, so to me,
maybe just can I give an example? Like in India right now, what is it called? Promundo. Promundo. This pumping large amounts of money, producing these images of men, good men wearing baseball caps, saying "I'm a good husband," etc., etc., and seeming use. And the other thing is, I want to mention is that they're using this GEM scale, gender equitable men. So they have these elaborate quantitative measure of at what point do you become a man who's actually a good man. And these are all based around very specific visual representations, but also of science. And I'm sure the NGOs that you're working maybe use this, and this GEM is the most bizarre, but there are huge amounts of money, and very few NGOs in Bangladesh and other smaller countries can refuse this money, right? So there's, as Lawrence's work showed, that there are certain ways through which so GEM then is a qualitative thing, but also it comes with visual representations of what is a good man, and they've been borrowed from the Brazilian case, for example, and the American case. And I'm wondering if you're aware of that kind of work.
What would be a good gay?
Yeah, what would be wearing a baseball cap?
No. A baseball cap is a big no-no, because the kind of region where I work in the coastal AP, hardly people knew the word gay. Like I'll tell you an example. We had this friend of ours who had come from Dubai to Vizag. That Vizag was his hometown, and a couple of community members knew that he was like MSM, and as part of our intervention, we always ask this MSM to congregate or to assemble at a common place which is called the drop-in center. So the invitation went to him, and he refused. So other people came back to me and they said, he's acting very funny. He's a gay. Just leave him. So there's a big divide between the MSM or the poor self-identified men who are part of this intervention taking services, to a person who's like and a couple of months later he comes to me and he asks me if I can have another DIC only for gay, because he knows a couple of other men in Vizag who would not love to hang around with these people. So that
it's like we're going to have two separate waiting rooms again for everybody.
Interesting.
One of the things I want to finish on in this last few minutes in this session is getting back to the kind of the biomedicalization of identity. And so, with HIV prevention and interventions and the huge amounts of money that are going into developing biomedical pharmaceutical interventions, there is this focus on and this importance to their success on what the behavior is and getting the identity right of the target population, if you will. So, interventions are being developed for receptive-only men. Interventions are being developed for insertive-only men. What happens when they do both? And so the surveys that are being asked are critically important to getting this right. Now, one of the things that, I've been thinking about is, we've been doing surveys for years, for say 8 years, where there have been these terms of double-decker already established. And the percentages of the population, the same population that categorize themselves as Koti, Panthi, double-decker, is changing over time. And is that really a change in someone's behavior, from the West, importing this versatile double-decker sort of behavior? Or is this just behavior that has existed and is just being generated from the survey and kind of pushing into categories? And this is kind of at the crux. I mean, there's a lot of dollars at stake in the biomedical world, and I don't know.
John, can I just ask,
Yeah.
out of ignorance, really,
Sure.
if you could give me an example of a differentiated biomedical intervention for a Koti and a Panthi, like what would that
Sure.
what would that translate out to?
Sure. So
I can understand the representation of it, but in terms of
Or a double-decker.
biomedical, what would that mean?
So physically, like what is
Right, I
that
mean, is
product?
it
So
distribution of
there's
prophylactics
like
or-
an anal microbicide.
Okay.
So an anal microbicide would be a gel that a Koti could apply, and that would protect the Koti from a penetrative act from someone who's positive. On the Panthi side, it might be circumcision one day. Not something that might happen in India, but that's one of the things. And then for someone who's a double-decker or someone who does both, it would be just taking a pill, this thing called PrEP, pre-exposure
Interesting.
prophylaxis.
But you wouldn't advise them to use an anal proboscide for...
So, I mean,
That's why I was curious when you see these divisions, because if you're saying on the one hand behavior is becoming fluid, then how is it affecting your distribution of biomedical preventive?
Yeah, so it's not, I think HIV prevention is not going to be the previous everybody wear a condom and that's it. This more specialized messaging, I don't know how the poster would look,
But John, can I point out
Yeah.
something with that? I think it's important to consider, what we were talking about earlier in terms of the, sort of there being an economic aspect of this, So I mean, I think that it's interesting that the array of options is increasing.
Sure.
And yet all of these options are very, from my view, are very cost prohibitive.
Absolutely.
Especially for the target audience of this in India, where, yes, there's a growing middle class, yes, there's more availability for them, but there is a huge number of people who don't have those economic means. And I think actually one discussion that we haven't really had in I think the public health discourse, and I owe this in some sense to one of my mentors, is Paula Treichler, who's I think she's been writing a history of the condom for a long time, is how simple that technology is, right? How in some ways it's a cheap, effective intervention, right?
Sure.
And all these new ones, there's no discussion, about really, I think, about the relationship between these technologies. It's almost like we're creating a space for the new without sort of paying attention to the old, and how, in some ways, how elegant the old actually still is.
Just one other thing here,
Yeah.
because the question, you get so quickly to the biomedical, and one of the things that's of concern in the public health arena is also, and which gets back to the question of representation, is how do you have this discussion? How are
Get
audiences
people to own up to-
conceived? So that's where these questions, I think, of behavior and identity come up. I mean, in the West, in the beginning, in terms of HIV studies, either you went to the homosexual population, which you thought you knew what it was and where it was, and you just pulled them in, and you don't ask them what they are, but you ask all about their behaviors. And when you're doing big national sex surveys, trying to include everybody in the population, we were the first survey in the US to include a question about identity. Because it seemed obvious to me as a gay man that, yeah, you want to know about people's risk behaviors, and that's what's going to count in terms of infection. But if you want to communicate with them, in France, at the same exact moment as that survey was being done, that was not a socially acceptable question. And no scientist or person in the society, it wasn't polite conversation. And in a survey, you don't want to offend your respondents. So there's no identity question. But when you read the research, done by the epidemiologists using that survey, they're basically racking their brains about how to translate homosexual, bisexual, and heterosexual behavior into categories, because the next step is you have to communicate what your results are. And if you're talking about using condoms or whatever it be, so this becomes a huge issue, and it's very fascinating to me trying to work on the India data to try to understand when these questions are asked in surveys in India, Koti, Panti, double-decker, and so on, it's not clear what the question is, and it's not clear to me what people are understanding the question, since there's so many meanings attached to each of these terms. In a certain context, you would want to claim that category. In another context, you wouldn't. And we don't always know, when we go to try to understand what we found, what was really going on.
One of the concerns around the category of behavior, and I mean, there's many things, and Anjali was alluding to them earlier, that as a social scientist of a certain kind, one might be concerned with what do we call behavior and what do we not call behavior. But there's a very simple reason why behavior is sometimes of concern. So one argument made for PrEP, that is for pharmaceutical prophylaxis as opposed to a condom, is that, come on, Naranjan, condoms have failed. And they failed because it's awful hard to change people's behavior, because that's what sex is. Sex is this driving force. And because behavior has failed, we need to turn to a non-behavioral intervention, taking a pill. Now, as decades of work on, for example, tuberculosis or many other diseases, taking a pill is an exquisite form, as anything is, of behavior. And so the idea that there are certain things that are behavioral that involve condoms and certain things that are not behavioral that involve pills is becoming a central way in which PrEP is being driven. Whether you have a cynical view, which is to create profits and to increasingly create a world in which many people won't have access, given anything we know about the current healthcare structure of the world, or less cynically, that we do this because we care and we're trying to sort of produce as many interventions as we can for as many people. And but it's very clear that taking a pill is as behavioral. So one of the problems with behavior is that it's used in a very specific rhetorical way, and more under current conditions of pharmaceuticalization. And it's the only thing I would say in answer to your earlier question, John, about is taking behavior for the moment as a more or less simple thing we understand, is behavior changing, or is it just that the words are changing? I would say it's probably both, not knowing yet, because it's an empirical question. And I would say it's probably both in the sense that there's been many scholars for a long, long time in the history of AIDS and the social sciences. I'm thinking of people from Ralph Bolton in anthropology to Don Kulik on this campus and others who have long argued that not only do people say and what people do is often different, but that difference is really important to both their behavior and their identity. And now it's easy for an anthropologist who doesn't like surveys as much to say, well, sure, I mean, it's really important to find other ways to get at what people are both saying and doing and how they relate to each other, because there's a limit to surveys. And one of the questions becomes, to the extent that AIDS intervention is based primarily on survey-based research, that these deformations, that is the limits of survey, have been so built into what our knowledge is that it's the question is, how do we even begin to think about where the limits to epidemiological research matter? And it's because it's not simple to say that there's a limit to the method. That limit to the method has become central to how communities fight over resources.
Well, there's
and so
also a
forth.
gender dimension to the consumption of a pill, right? When you say the pill, it's always usually thought about as a contraceptive. I mean, I think that's the interesting place to think about as well. So.
Great. So on that note, thank you everyone for this discussion. Now, what we're going to do right now is we're going to take about a 25, 30-minute intermission. And during this time, ourselves, we're going to generate questions amongst the panel, but we're also looking intently at the questions and comments that are being posted on the Facebook site, as well as being tweeted in, and we also have an email address, which I think is india.msm. Can you remind me, Rach? msm.in.india@gmail.com. So please post your questions. We're going to look at them, take the best ones, and discuss them in the next session. Thank you.